Hey guys, I know it's been a while since I've posted anything. I have been in the middle of a move and life has been pretty hectic, but I've come across a body of work that I'm going to spend the next several videos reading for you guys. I know that it's hard for people to sit down and read, and this particular, having the time to sit down and read, not that you have difficulty reading. And this particular subject matter is very dense and complex. So I'm going to do my best. It's 135 pages. I think this is good information for us to have. However, I know that it's going to be a very select few who are really going to get as into it as I did. I'm absolutely over the moon about it. It excites me when I read it because this is the kind of stuff that I am drawn to. So the name of this paper is called Scalar Energy, Morphogenetic Field Mechanics, Bio-Cybernetic Medicine, and the Non-Locality of the Unified Field via NDE, or Near-Death Experience, as a revolutionary model for bioenergetic regeneration and self-healing. That's a long name. This was written by Jere Rivera Dugenio, PhD, of the International Quantum University for Integrative Medicine. This was presented in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2015. So here's a short abstract. I'm just going to get right into it. The author purposes an advanced quantum medicine model based upon scalar energy, morphogenetic field mechanics, bio-cybernetic medicine, and in the non-locality property of the unified field described by the author's own NDE. Individuals with acute, standard, and chronic health conditions stem from underlying distortions within the energetic, mental, emotional, and physical systems within the biological energetic organism. However, the frequently ignored aspect is not whether the immune system is weak or strong, but rather whether the immune system is blind or not. What determines an immune system being able to recognize and address stressors within the bioenergetic organism is the capacity for uninterrupted cellular communications within the DNA and RNA. It is my experience with treating real-life cases that by understanding and applying the principles of bio-cybernetic medicine, advanced scalar energy morphogenetic field mechanics, and the non-locality of the unified field, individuals with acute, standard, and chronic health conditions can assist their own immune system via scalar wave information to stimulate the self-regulating healing abilities of their own biological energetic systems. Over a 5 to 24 month period, subjects with acute, standard, and chronic health conditions who were balanced via the advanced quantum medicine model achieved higher bioenergetic self-healing rates with no reversion. Data suggests that inclusion of this advanced quantum medicine model within one's own preventative health protocol may lead to important advancements within the current quantum medicine model. Chapter 1, Introduction. Here's a quote from Nikola Tesla. But I hope that it will also be demonstrated soon that in my experiments in the West, I was not merely beholding a vision, but caught sight of a great and profound truth. End quote. Nikola Tesla, experimental physicist and the greatest inventor of the 20th century, was an extreme sensitive that as a young boy had vivid visions of his future extraordinary inventions. In 1975, at age 10, I entered a public speaking contest at school in which I chose the topic Life After Life, based upon the book and near-death experience research of Dr. Raymond Moody. Ironically, I've read that book. Ironically, 25 years later, in 2000, after a 20-year drug, alcohol, and sex addiction, I underwent my own NDE when I suffered a cardiac arrest, momentarily dying for several minutes as a result of a massive drug overdose. Within that lucid, non-local event of my NDE, 1, I experienced multidimensional or transharmonic reality outside the confines of my three-dimensional physical body. 2, I experienced myself as conscious, living, personal morphogenetic field pattern with 360-degree conscious awareness interwoven and connected within the greater cosmic morphogenetic unified field. And 3, I consciously experienced what I refer to as transharmonic identity accretion, wherein portions of my faster oscillating higher dimensional consciousness began harmonically downloading and replacing my slower oscillating lower dimensional conscious identity. Some identify this type of experience as being called a walk-in experience, in which a new consciousness replaces the old consciousness. Think of it as being similar to downloading new software update to replace older software on a computer. As a direct result of this transharmonic quantum leap during my NDE, my previous addictions ceased to exist. My perceptual filters shifted, whereby my primary focus of perception became multidimensional rather than three-dimensional. Discontinuous activation of my higher sensory perceptions, such as direct cognition awareness, telepathy, biolocation of consciousness, and a deeper understanding and connection with the basic order and systems function of the greater unified field. Albert Einstein proposed his famous E equals mc squared equation in 1905, but the impetus behind his theory of relativity began in 1892, when, as a young teenager, he experienced a dream in which he went as fast as the speed of light. Quote, I knew I had to understand that dream, and you could say that my entire scientific career has been a meditation on that dream. End quote. Similarly, I knew that through the cellular memory of my NDE, I would come to know that the potential for organic, bioenergetic regeneration and self-healing within the physical, mental, emotional, and energetic systems of all biological organisms is directly related to and affected by better understanding the morphogenetic field template surrounding the DNA, as well as systems function of the greater unified field. In the late 1890s, C.W. Ledbetter and Annie Besant, prominent leaders of the Theosophical Society, were both pre-New Age channelers who entered altered states to describe molecules, atoms, and subatomic atoms called Anu, years before science had confirmed their theories. After I was resuscitated, I went to the nearest hospital emergency room just to make sure all of my vital systems were functioning normal. To everyone's surprise, including my own and the attending emergency room physician, not one drug was found in my blood or urine after testing. What had happened to the multiple drugs that I had previously consumed over a 12-hour period straight? No one could explain this phenomenon. This experience was the impetus behind my proposed theory for organic, bioenergetic regeneration and self-healing called morphogenetic cellular reprogramming, in which I have proved through this dissertation and my case studies that higher oscillating scalar frequency is capable of reprogramming and repatterning the morphogenetic fields of a cell, organ, functional system, and the bioenergetic body via the physio-regulatory matrix of the human body. Research suggests that epigenetic changes, such as modifications to DNA and histones, alter gene expression patterns and regulate cell identity. Since that transformational day where I experienced the transfer of consciousness via the NDE, I have not relapsed, nor have I had any serious health issues. In order to fully know how to successfully heal the human bioenergetic organism, it is vital that one understands morphogenetic field mechanics, the transfer of non-local consciousness, and the death process, for this allows a much deeper, significantly holistic perspective to life. This is why the current quantum medicine model needs to be updated due to the simple fact it was designed by those who never experienced the near-death process. We must have a clearer picture on how and why death occurs, as well as the near-death experience, before we try to identify what the important part for healing may look like otherwise. It is equivalent to taking a Boeing 767 jetliner, breaking it down to its smallest piece, then giving that piece to an engineer and asking the engineer, what did this piece come out of? Within this dissertation, I will propose a new advanced quantum medicine model based upon real-life case studies and my personal NDE experience. Chapter 2, Review of Related Literature. Introduction to Death and Longevity. One of the greatest fears on this planet is the fear of death. This is the highest insult to universal life that exists, for if you are afraid of dying, you simply do not remember who you are, where you came from, what your life purpose is, and equally important, you have no idea where you are going once you drop your physical body. From birth, we are programmed to fear death by not talking about it and being told it is taboo. We are manipulated to be afraid of dying, and by doing so, we completely deny our own ability to self-heal. The root cause of death is very straightforward. We die because our cells age, then die. In 1961, Leonard Hayflick, a researcher at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, discovered that there was a limit to the number of times a human cell could divide. After about 70 divisions, a cell derived from embryonic tissue enters a stage where its ability to divide slows and then eventually stops. This stage is called cellular senescence. Hayflick also observed that the number of times a cell could divide was governed by the age of the cells. Cells from a 20-year-old could divide more times than cells from a 50-year-old, which in turn would divide more times than cells from a 90-year-old. Hayflick discovered that, in essence, there is a clock ticking inside every dividing cell of our body. Our aging process is not simply a consequence of accumulated damage. There is a specific property of our cells that limits how long we can live. The nature of this property was proposed independently in the early 1970s by both Soviet and American scientists. When a cell divides, the genetic material inside that cell needs to be copied. This process is called DNA replication. These scientists suggest that the limitation on the cell division is rooted in the very nature of DNA replication. The enzymes that replicate a strand of DNA are unable to continue replicating all the way to the end, which causes the loss of some DNA. It is imperative that awareness of the aspects that will decrease the length and quality of life is essential in order to regulate which actions may be able to intervene in this damage. The negative effects of oxygen can be witnessed throughout the biochemical arena, yet it is the most important element to support life. Cells cannot last for more than 4+ minutes without oxygen, as it leads to cellular death. However, it is vital for the production of energy in mitochondria. Integrate this with toxins prevalent in our air, food, and water, accumulating in our bodies, and combine it to the further discovery that a great deal of damage, i.e. disease and aging, was being carried out by free radicals, oxidants, in our system. The problem with these positively charged ions are that they are seeking for an electron to steal. Free radicals search the body, seeking an electron indiscriminately, not considering the source or the potential damage caused, and our immune systems had been overwhelmed in the process of trying to handle this onslaught. This is what is known as oxidative stress. Section 2, Telomeres. In 2006, Professor Elizabeth Blackburn unveiled the relationship between telomeres, aging, and disease. Blackburn and her co-authors were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 2009 for their discovery of the protective cap at the end of chromosomes called telomeres. Telomeres are DNA protein complexes located at the ends of chromosomes. Telomeres protect the DNA during replication. The telomeres on the end of the genes get worn away and shortened during cellular division, and when this happens, the DNA can get damaged. This causes mutations and changes in the DNA, which lead to aging and cell death. Damaged DNA then begins to send incomplete information and codes to the cell that causes secretion of the wrong enzymes and chemicals. This eventually leads to the shutting down and death of the cell. It is this distorted programming and false triggering of genetic responses that can lead to cell death, and eventually we end up dying as a consequence. The pace at which telomeres shorten is associated with the cell's ability to withstand oxidative damage. Therefore, the more antioxidants present in one's body, the less damage that occurs to the chromosome. Imagine a DNA strand as a long row of concrete bricks, and the DNA replication as a bricklayer walking backwards on the top of the brick wall, laying a new layer on top of that row. When the end of the wall is reached, the bricklayer suddenly finds himself standing on top of the brick he is supposed to replicate. Since he cannot place down another brick where his feet are, he steps back and falls off the wall, leaving the very end of the wall bare and brickless. The result is the new copy of the brick wall is shorter than the original. Just like this brick wall copied imperfectly, it's in a figure 1, our DNA is unable to create a perfect copy of it. When a new DNA strand is replicated, the new strand is shorter than the original. These repetitive sequences are called telomeres, which, like all DNA, are made up of nucleotides arranged like pearl beads in a string. The nucleotides in human telomeres are arranged in repeating sequence, TTAGGG, 2 thymine nucleotides, 1 adenine nucleotide, and 3 guanine nucleotides. This amazing sequence is repeated hundreds of times in tandem in every telomere. Each time our cells divide and our chromosomes replicate, our telomeres become shorter. At conception, the telomeres in our single-cell embryos are approximately 15,000 nucleotides long. Our cells divide so rapidly in the embryonic sac that at birth our telomeres have decreased in length to approximately 10,000 nucleotides. During one's lifetime, telomeres continue to shorten, and when telomeres reach an average of approximately 5,000 nucleotides, our cells can no longer divide any further. It is at that point we die of old age. Leonard Hayflick had discovered that there was a clock ticking in every dividing cell of our body. Telomere shortening explains what makes that clock tick. Section 2.13. Telomerase. Obviously, there must be a way for our bodies to re-lengthen telomeres. Otherwise, our sperm and egg cells would contain telomeres the same length as the rest of our cells, which would yield embryos as old as we are. Because so much cell division takes place in the womb, our children would then be born much older than us. Humanity could not exist more than a generation or two if this were the case. However, our reproductive cells do not exhibit telomere shortening and show no signs of aging. They are essentially immortal. They are our germline, the same one that has been dividing since the beginning of life on this planet. The reason these cells are immortal is that our reproductive cells produce an enzyme called telomerase, which is a polymerizing enzyme and specialized cellular ribonucleoprotein, RNP reverse transcriptase, or RT. The complete replication of telomeric DNA requires telomerase. The core enzyme contains the protein TERT, which has an RT homology domain as well as other essential conserved domains, and the RNA component TER. By copying a short template sequence within its intrinsic RNA moiety, telomerase synthesizes the telomeric DNA strand running 5 feet to 3 feet towards the distal end of the chromosome, thereby extending it. Telomerase acts like an assembly line inside our cells that adds nucleotides to the ends of our chromosomes, thus lengthening our telomeres. In a cell that expresses telomerase, telomeres are lengthened as soon as they shorten. It's as though every time the telomere clock inside our cells ticks once, telomerase pushes the hands of the clock back 1 tick. Telomerase works by filling the gap left by DNA replication. Returning to the analogy of the bricklayer that can't lay the last brick on the wall, telomerase would be like an angel that flies in and puts the last brick in place. Section 2.14. Telomere lengthening therapy. The question to be raised is it possible to insert the telomerase gene into all of our cells and extend our lifespan? Inserting the gene directly into our DNA through the use of viral vectors is not a viable option. The main problem with this approach is that inserting genes into cells often causes cancer. That's because the gene gets inserted into our chromosomes at random sites, and if the wrong site is chosen, the gene can interrupt and disable cancer suppressor genes or turn on cancer-inducing genes. And you only need one of the 100 trillion cells in your body to become cancerous in order to kill you. Fortunately, the telomerase gene already exists in all our cells. That's because the DNA in every one of our cells is identical. A skin cell, muscle cell, and liver cell all contain exactly the same genetic information. Thus, if the cells that create our sperm and egg cells contain the code for telomerase, every other cell must contain that code as well. The reason that most of our cells don't express telomerase is that the gene is repressed in them. There are one or more regions of DNA neighboring the telomerase gene that serve as binding sites for a protein, and if that protein is bound to them, telomerase would not be created by the cell. However, it is possible to coax that repressor protein off its binding site with the use of a small molecule, drug-like compound that binds to the repressor and prevents it from attaching to the DNA. If we find the appropriate compound, we can turn telomerase on in every cell in the human body. Compounds such as these have recently been discovered. One such compound is TA65, a nutraceutical discovered by Garin Corporation and licensed to TA scientists. Additionally, Sierra Sciences, using a robotically driven high-throughput drug screening effort, has discovered over 200 compounds in 29 distinct drug families that induce the expression of telomerase in normal cells. However, the perfect drug hasn't been found yet. None of the compounds induce telomerase in large enough quantities that we can be confident in their ability to extend the lifespan of a cell. Even the strongest known compound induces only 6% of the telomerase expression found in some immortal cell lines. Also, many of these compounds, with the notable exception of TA65, are somewhat toxic to cell cultures and probably unsafe for human consumption. Science has progressed to the point that availability of antioxidants will allow the body to eliminate and/or decrease the damage caused by free radicals, known as oxidative stress. Antioxidants are substances that are generally ingested and provide electrons to bind with dangerous free radicals and neutralize them in order for the body to dispose of them. Antioxidants outside of the carotenoids enter the electron cascade, which means their compound effect is more than the sum of effect and the single components. Antioxidants such as vitamins A, C, E, and selenium, all present in moringa, by the way, will reduce an electron to a free radical and bind it, transforming it into a relatively harmless molecule fit for excretion. The trace elements zinc and selenium are important for our antioxidant enzyme system. Moringa contains ample amounts of 46 bioavailable enzymatically active different antioxidants, including vitamin A and the carotenoids. A proprietary formula, assorted parts of the moringa tree, which are the leaf puree, fruit puree, and seed cake, ensures a diverse assortment of bioavailable antioxidants. In order to protect your ability to reproduce, it is imperative to protect your chromosomes. The antioxidants found in moringa afford a protective shield to do so. Section 2.15, Proofs of Principle. There is a plan in place for inducing telomerase in all our cells. But will that plan work? Will it cure aging? That's the trillion-dollar question, and scientists have been trying to answer it for more than a decade. So far, all the signs point to yes, telomerase is a very likely cure for aging. In 1997, scientists inserted the telomerase gene into normal human skin cells grown in a petri dish. When they observed that the telomerase enzyme was being produced in the cells, as hoped, they also observed the skin cells became immortal. There was no limit to the number of times these cells could divide. When the lengths of the telomeres in these telomerized cells were examined, the scientists were surprised to see that the telomeres didn't just stop shortening, they got longer. The critical question then was whether the cells were becoming younger. A few years later, scientists inserted the telomerase gene into human skin cells that already had very short telomeres. These cells were then grown into skin on the back of mice. As one would expect, skin from the cells that hadn't received the telomerase gene looked like old skin. It was wrinkled, blistered easily, and had gene expression patterns indicative of old skin. The skin grown from cells that had received the telomerase gene, on the other hand, looked young. It acted like young skin, and most importantly, its gene expression patterns, as analyzed by DNA array chip analysis, were almost identical to the gene expression patterns of young skin. For the first time ever, scientists had demonstrably reversed aging in human cells. Would the concept apply to living organisms? In November 2008, scientists published a paper describing how they had created cloned mice from mouse cells containing the inserted telomerase gene, which continually produced the telomerase enzyme. These mice were shown to live 50% longer than cloned mice created from cells that didn't contain the inserted telomerase gene. It's becoming increasingly clear that prevention of telomere shortening might be the best way to extend human lifespan beyond the theoretical 125-year maximum lifespan. How long this can extend the human lifespan is anyone's guess, but living a healthy, youthful life to 250, 500, or even 1,000 years is not outside the realm of possibility. More research needs to be done to answer that question. Section 2.16, Molecular Compaction. Molecular compaction is the process by which higher oscillating frequency energy, i.e. Kundalini energy, is accreted into the cellular bioenergetic fields, and since cells are not functioning due to cellular senescence, begins to crush the remaining parts of the dysfunctional electrotonal receivers in the neurological pathways of the body, also known as miasma. This disperses erratic, distorted energy throughout the bioenergetic meridian lines and bioenergetic fields. When this happens, the next set of frequency currents that accrete will follow the same process, but now there is more damage due to the frequency buildup from the previous time. Due to our inability of the DNA, meridian lines, and therefore the body to be able to naturally receive and synthesize higher oscillating frequency, molecular compaction is the reason why we die and is the ultimate cause of death behind every single malady as far as health issues. Natural death occurs when there is no longer enough energy left within cellular structure to sustain the body mechanisms. However, if the central point is activated, located near the heart region in the physical body, somewhat to the right of the heart and often called the heart or the fourth chakra, new energy can be brought from the unified morphogenetic fields into the acupuncture points, and it can be expanded beyond its original form. Death of the physical atomic body occurs when the mortal body has reached a point of expending its birth quantum donated from the combined quantum energy from the egg of the mother and sperm of the father. Section 2.2, Near-Death Experience. Introduction to the NDE. It is possible to have cardiac arrest and be resuscitated back to life. This is exactly what happened to me in 2000, and over the past half century, many people have been brought back to life after they died. It is the birth of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, and intensive care medicine, which dates back to the 60s, that has enabled people who had reached death by cardiorespiratory criteria to be resuscitated back to life and subsequently maintained alive through life support measures. Some people have had intense, life-changing experiences, myself included. What exactly is an NDE? Since the earliest cultures, there have been strange accounts of experiences reported by those who have come close to death or in a condition of emotional or physical distress, leading to an array of perceptions, creating a familiar, inclusive event often called an NDE. It should be noted that experiencing a cardiac arrest or some type of life-threatening event does not, by itself, constitute an NDE. The term NDE is used to describe specific cognitive experiences and sensations such as an outer body experience or an OBE. No time, expansive 360-degree awareness, peacefulness, and tranquility. The increase in awareness occurring near death or during the first stages of death can be traced back to the 1960s and the introduction of resuscitation science. Following the acceptance and implementation of resuscitation techniques in clinical practice, there have obviously been more and more people brought back from death. But it wasn't really until the 1970s that interest by the scientific community and the general population in these experiences peaked with the publication by Raymond Moody, an American psychiatrist with a background in philosophy, of the best-selling book Life After Life, which was a collection of accounts given by 150 survivors of near-death encounters. This was the first comprehensive study of the human experience during the dying process. Moody coined the term NDE due to the fact that the patient's experiences were defined from the time the patient was unconscious. There are arguments regarding the causes of NDE. There are those who believe an NDE can offer glimpses into the life after death and believe it is a chance to learn more about the mysteries of the universe. Others have a more skeptical approach and believe an NDE is just an illusion that can be explained in scientific terms, for example, brought about by an excess of carbon dioxide, etc. Their curiosity mostly arises from the need to find out the latest on the brain's evolution, or it may just be plain scientific curiosity. NDEs are not illusions. Outside of the control group of 121, Dr. Melvin Morse interviewed 37 children that had been treated with mind-altering medication, such as anesthetic agents, narcotics, Valium, Thorazine, Haldol, Dilantin, antidepressants, mood elevators, and painkillers. None of the children experienced an NDE or anything close to an NDE. One child, specifically due to the nature of her medical condition, was helped to hallucinate. Nothing she described resembled an NDE. Further, she told Morse that she was fully cognizant of being hypnotized. There are no medical explanations for NDE, such as a lack of oxygen to the brain or emotional reasons, such as images produced from fear chemicals of a dying brain. Dr. Pim van Lommel of the Renstad Hospital at Arnhem, Netherlands, came out with a study cited in The Lancet that can be cited for major NDE scientific findings, the largest being that NDEs are not medically explicable. Van Lommel proved under rigid methodology that the occurrence of the NDE was not associated with duration of cardiac arrest or unconsciousness, medication, or fear of death prior to the cardiac arrest. Given the similarity in physiological makeup of the sample population, one would expect that most of the 344 patients should experience an NDE. This would take into account the skeptic argument of cerebral anoxia or dying of brain cells. However, that is not the case. The findings were that 18% of the 344 cardiac arrest patients had an NDE, with 12% of the 18% reporting a core experience. Therefore, an NDE is not correlated with physiological causes of death. However, the study did find that age might play a factor in the occurrence of NDEs, and that younger experiencers were more likely to have an NDE and more likely to have a core experience. The same argument pertaining to physiological makeup could be made for those in the sample population who were psychologically afraid of death right before the cardiac arrest. However, there was no difference between those who were afraid and reported an NDE as opposed to those who were afraid and did not report an NDE. Therefore, NDE doesn't appear to be caused by emotional makeup such as fear. Another study shows that the children in Morse's study were also hypoxic, had acid-based disturbances, and had high CO2 levels, and every combination you could imagine. Yet they had nothing like an NDE. The most remarkable characteristic of an NDE is not so much the features briefly summarized above, but rather the transformation those who have experienced it firsthand undergo. An NDE often impacts a person with a positive life effect, making them more selfless, more spiritual, less materialistic, and less afraid of death, with an increased faith and interest in the meaning of life. Certainly, these long-lasting and deep changes in attitudes and behaviors following an NDE are a reality that can be socially observed, unlike the more personal or subjective experiences we have referred to above. At present, given the NDE phenomenon's positive imprint on people's lives, it undeniably calls for further research. Section 2.22, Aspects of Near-Death Experience. Dr. Moody determined that the near-death survivors all had described similar strange experiences that included the following features: out-of-body experience, or OBE, peace and tranquility, review of their life, witnessing a bright light and tunnel, witnessing deceased relatives, experiencing a heaven. NDE survivors also shared about a point which they could not cross, or else they could not return back to life. Frequently, they said they had been hesitant to return to life because they had an incredibly peaceful and freeing experience. Another important aspect of these experiences was the deep, positive, and lasting impact they had in people, rendering them more altruistic, less afraid of death. People's beliefs, values, and attitudes were positively transformed, and they felt a new sense of purpose and appreciation for life. In his book, Raymond Moody explains that, despite the striking similarities, no two experiences were alike, no one had ever reported all the aspects of the NDE. People who had these experiences did not tend to have so many of the above features. In fact, they may only have recalled a limited number of the 15 NDE aspects. There was no single component that was described in every experience, although some came close to being universal. No single element of the composite experience appeared in only one account, and the order of the stages a person went through varied from what had been described in the NDE. For example, quote, various persons have reported seeing the being of light or at the same time as they left their physical bodies, or, end quote. Or somebody may have had an out-of-body experience at the beginning of their near-death experience, while another person may have seen a light at the beginning and have had only an out-of-body experience at the end. However, the order in which the stages occurred in the NDE is quite typical, and important differences were not observed. In general, those who were so-called dead tended to have more thorough experiences than those who were only near death. Also, the longer period of the time they were dead, they got the deeper experiences. Many of Raymond Moody's findings in his initial study have been confirmed over the following decades, and presently, NDEs are understood as often profoundly transforming experiences, who are also vivid and realistic, occurring to people who have been close to death or have suffered a cardiac arrest and have thus gone beyond the threshold of death. Section 2.23, Recent Reports of NDEs. Does an NDE provide an indication of the life after death of the physical body? The years that followed 1975 saw an increase in both discussions about the NDE phenomenon, as well as in the number of OBEs and NDE reports. The naysayers claimed that it was due to the publicity seekers, but when researchers began to investigate these accounts in more detail, they discovered very little evidence to support this view, for many of the accounts predated the 1970s. Interestingly, some of the cases went back decades, even centuries. Furthermore, in the vast majority of cases, the survivors involved regularly declined any publicity and only wished to share their experiences with researchers. Often they had not even mentioned them to their close family and friends. In the 1980s, there were accounts of individuals who had experienced a negative NDE. These individuals often described the devil, demons, fearsome vacuums, zombies, and other hostile experiences. It was never determined whether these experiences really occurred when the individual had been near death, or quite possibly it was due to an excess of carbon dioxide in the blood, which is known to lead to such negative experiences. Nonetheless, these supposed negative experiences have not been reported in any prospective study of NDE during cardiac arrest, and it is ambiguous whether they really are NDE or some other subjective experience. Section 2.24, Historical Reports. Investigating back into historical times, the NDE phenomenon has been prevalent throughout ancient history and in different ancient cultures. Scholar and researcher Gregory Shushan analyzed the differences and similarities between 5 major ancient cultures: Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt, Sumerian and Old Babylonian, Mesopotamia, Vedic India, pre-Buddhist China, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and modern accounts of near-death experiences. His findings were quite intriguing, as many modern experiences were found to be similar to what's described by ancient cultures. Shushan found that, quote, afterlife conceptions are not entirely culturally determined and appear to be universal or quasi-universal to some degree, end quote. Plato's Republic, written in 360 BCE, contains a near-death experience of a soldier named who had an NDE after being killed in battle. Described his soul leaving his body, being judged along with other souls, and seeing heaven. In 1516, a Dutch painter named Hieronymus Bosch described a passage down a tunnel towards a bright light in a painting entitled Ascent to Empyrean. The 19th century Swiss geologist and mountaineer Albert Heim, who almost died in a mountaineering accident, reported the first systemic series of accounts from people who had near-death experiences. Heim collected 30 first-hand accounts from other near-death survivors of near-fatal mountaineering accidents and discovered that they had similar experiences. He uncovered that in many cases there were sudden review of the person's entire life, as well as hearing beautiful music, and dropped into what they experienced as a superbly blue heaven containing rose clouds. It would reveal that irrespective of the reason for their causation, the NDE phenomena are unlikely to be the result of fabrications, but rather experiences that are universal and have existed throughout different cultures. It then appears that for the majority of humans, there is a universal experience at the end of their lives, such as the one I had experienced during my NDE. Interestingly, these claims have been supported by a number of recent scientific studies conducted by independent researchers, demonstrating that 10 to 20% of humans who go through cardiac arrest and clinical death report some similar lucid, well-structured thought processes, reasoning, memories, and detailed recall of events during their NDE. Section 2.25, Sociocultural Factors. With regards to the role of the sociocultural factors and their potential influence on the mental processes reported during cardiac arrest when an NDE occurs, it is imperative to point out that they are of great scientific interest because if all the experiences reflect people's preconceived ideas, this would entail that an NDE is based upon a person's own background instead of a universal phenomenon that transcends cultural and religious views. Due to their importance, sociocultural factors should continue to be investigated within the NDE phenomena. Does one's belief system, social and cultural background, thoughts, memories, perceptions affect one's near-death experience? Understanding the role of culture is imperative, perhaps, because if all the NDEs only reflect people's preconceived ideas, this would support the notion that an NDE is simply based upon an individual's own background and belief system rather than being a universal phenomenon. The main aspects of an NDE have been recorded throughout history and across numerous cultures and religious groups. Reports of an NDE have been also described by atheists as well as those with a specific faith, whether they were non-practicing or practicing members of that specific religion. Historically, experiences closely mirroring an NDE have been described by Argentinian, Bolivian, and North American Indians, as well as Buddhist, Islamic, and Chinese writings. The most common aspects are A. Having an OBE, B. A reunion with deceased relatives and friends, C. An experience of light followed by the feelings of joy and peace, and D. A border or dividing line between the realm of the living and the deceased. In more recent times, the NDE phenomenon has been reported in many areas of the world, including India, China, South America, and the Middle East. During one study conducted in 1985, the experiences of 16 Asian Indians had been compared with those of the Americans, and it was discovered that the Indians had encountered Yamraj, the Hindu king of the dead, while the Americans had not. In 1977, the largest cross-cultural study had been carried out by researchers Osis and Haraldson, who focused more on deathbed visions, which are the experiences that people have before death, usually in the 24 hours prior to death, and these are different from the classic NDE phenomenon. Caretakers who have looked after a person during the dying process normally report that person's deathbed visions. In this study, the researchers had examined the visions of 440 terminally ill American and Indian patients as described to their doctors and nurses. The most common feature that occurred in 91% of the cases was seeing deceased relatives. In 140 cases, there were reports of seeing religious figures such as God or an angel. Where these specifically identified, they were always described according to the person's religious beliefs. For example, no Christian reported seeing a Hindu deity, and no Hindu reported seeing Jesus. Interestingly, at the time of my NDE, I did not subscribe to any religious faith. During my NDE, I experienced myself as a pure conscious energy, and I did receive an inaudible information download describing my soul contract on Earth, but I did not see any religious figure of any kind. In a more recent study, since sociocultural differences are thought to potentially account for variations observed in the NDE phenomenon, the authors analyzed whether societal beliefs influence NDEs. Since the prevailing Western model of an NDE was defined by Moody's description of the phenomenon in 1975, in order to explore the influence of this cultural model, the authors compared 24 near-death experience phenomena accounts collected before 1975 and 24 after 1975. The only difference observed was the increased frequency of the tunnel phenomenon that other research has suggested may not be integral to the experience, and not in any of the remaining 14 aspects defined by Moody as a characteristic of near-death experience phenomena. These data challenges the hypothesis that prevailing cultural models substantially influences NDE accounts. It has been shown that near-death experiences have been documented throughout different cultures as well as throughout history. The main question that remains unrequited is how frequent does a near-death experience occur in the present times, and do NDEs only occur to a small percentage of the population? During the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, NDE research focused on characterizing the diverse aspects of a near-death experience. However, researchers also examined its prevalence, and different case studies report differing occurrences in the mass population. Number one, a telephone survey of a representative sample of the Australian population carried out by Pereira et al. In 2005 concluded that 8.9% of the population has experienced an NDE. Number two, a German study carried out by Knobloch in 2001 reports that 4% of the sample population had experienced an NDE. According to the Gallup and Proctor survey in 80 and 81 of a representative sample of the American population, data showed that 15% had a near-death experience. Number four, in a more clinical setting, Van Lommel, a cardiologist from the Netherlands, studied a group of patients who had suffered cardiac arrests and who were successfully revived. They found that 62 patients, 18%, had a near-death experience, of which 41, or 12%, described a core experience. Number five, 10% were reported by Grayson. These are people he's referencing, by the way, in the paper, and I'm going to post this in the description. Number six, 6% were reported by Parnia. Although the occurrence of the near-death experience reveals a significant variance, 4 to 19%, even at the lower end of the range, 4%, the data indicate that an astoundingly high proportion of the population experience a near-death experience. Section 2.26, how to identify an NDE. Many alternative and integrative health practitioners have experienced a sense of bliss, pleasure, or even seen a bright light, or perhaps have sensed they were going through darkness. But can we say whether they have experienced a near-death experience? Most likely not. This is why one of the main questions that needs to be observed in the study of the NDE is a classification system. This system should be subtle enough to reveal most NDEs, but not so subtle as to not be able to differentiate them from other analogous mental states. By observing the characteristics described by Moody and other NDE investigators, it is obvious that many of the aspects that make up an NDE are not specific to only those who have come near to death. There are many accounts of people who were physically not near to death, having feelings of peace and observing a bright light or tunnel. In reality, the peaceful bliss feeling or experiencing a light or tunnel can occur under many other circumstances that are not related to being near to death. In order for an experience to be defined as an NDE, there must be a series of common characteristics, and not just one or two, so that NDE experiences can be set apart from other mental states. So how do we differentiate between an NDE and other experiences similar to it, but yet undoubtedly different? The solution is a research scale. In the 1980s, two American NDE investigators set out to find a solution to this problem, and both of them created a scale using marginally different criteria. These scales were easily managed, and it was claimed they could verify the presence or absence of an NDE. When looking at the research, a number of studies exist where proper classification systems have not been used, and this unfortunately makes their results difficult to determine. This is because it is uncertain whether the experiences being studied are NDEs or other similar mental states. In these studies, NDE investigators only asked subjects about their proximity to death and their beliefs, and not about the characteristics of their experiences. This is quite a different approach from the phenomenological approach that characterizes the two scales referred to above. So it is difficult to tell what these studies were showing. One of the above studies examined the role of sleep patterns in NDEs in a sample of 55 patients. The conclusion was that they could be related. However, there was no evidence that NDEs were similar to other mental states they were referring to, and more importantly, the physiology of the two states was quite different. Another study that received widespread attention in the press examined how carbon dioxide could explain the occurrence of near-death experiences. The most revealing point against carbon dioxide levels as a cause for the NDE is exposed by cardiac arrest NDEs, where all patients have high carbon dioxide levels, but only 10% have NDEs. Professor Olaf Blank and his team conducted two more studies that obtained extensive media coverage. The first of these concluded that out-of-body experiences are simply illusions brought about by an abnormally functioning brain. The cases that have been described do not, in fact, resemble out-of-body experiences as described by those who have had them. There is nothing to suggest that NDEs are the same, and this suggestion is still highly debatable and likely to be erroneous. Section 2.27, the Weighted Core Experience Index. In 1980, an American psychologist, Kenneth Ring, developed a 10-point interview scale in order to allow researchers to differentiate between near-death and other experiences that allowed the experiences to be standardized and measured. The research scale was named the Weighted Core Experience Index, or WCEI, which Ring presented in his book. The WCEI was intended to measure the phenomenological and depth variety of NDEs. Ring then analyzed the experiences of 102 people who had come near to death and found that based upon his weighted scale, 48% of his group had experienced an NDE. Ring concluded that there was a core experience which developed in a distinctive pattern. The stages he described were: 1. An experience of peace, well-being, and absence of pain. 2. A sense of detachment from the physical body, progressing to an out-of-body experience. 3. Entering darkness, a tunnel experience with panoramic memory and predominantly positive effect. 4. An experience of light that is bright, warm, and attractive. 5. Entering the light, meeting persons or figures. Other non-core experiences, which he also referred to, include reviewing one's life, encountering a presence, encountering deceased loved ones, and deciding to return. Ring believed an NDE consists of stages and wrote, in general, quote, in general, the early stages of the experience are more common and the latter stages manifest themselves with systematically decreasing frequency, end quote. Both the WCEI and the NDE scale developed by Professor Grayson have improved consistency in the field, have decreased the ambiguity in descriptions of both the phenomenology and the frequency of the NDE experience, since they have been useful methods to identify NDEs. It seems that incidence estimates are higher with the WCEI, with an average score of 37%, than with the NDE scale, which yields 18% incidence average score. Section 2.28, the Grayson scale. One of the most widely used scales to classify and differentiate NDEs from other mental states was developed in 1983 by Professor Bruce Grayson, a psychiatrist who currently teaches at the University of Virginia. Grayson criticized the Ring scale, or the WCEI, as being based upon 10 arbitrary points that were originated from the occurrence of what was then thought to be the most fundamental features of the NDE. As the scientific understanding of the NDE grew, it became clear that a new scale was required. Grayson devised this measurement scale, which he based upon interviews with 74 people who had had NDEs. He then collected the 16 most frequently encountered features as recalled by his sample of 74 people and developed a 16-characteristic questionnaire, which he termed the Grayson scale. Below is a description of the Grayson scale. Number 1, experiencing an altered state of time. Number 2, experiencing accelerated thought processes. Number 3, life review. 4, sudden sense of understanding. 5, feelings of peace. 6, feelings of joy. 7, feelings of cosmic oneness. 8, seeing, feeling surrounded by light. 9, having vivid sensations. 10, extrasensory perception. 11, experiencing visions. 12, experiencing a sense of being out of physical body. 13, experiencing a sense of an otherworldly environment. 14, experiencing a sense of a mystical entity. 15, experiencing a sense of deceased or religious figures. 16, experiencing a sense of a border or point of no return. The Grayson scale gives each of the 16 characteristics a score of 0, 1, or 2. The score depends initially on whether the aspect has been experienced, 1, and secondly on how intense the experience has been. If intense, then 2. Therefore, using this scale, anyone's experience can be graded and given a score. There is a potential maximum score of 32, but for an experience to be defined as an NDE, Grayson stated that a minimum score of 7 was needed. When I took the Grayson test, my personal score was 21 out of a maximum 32. Research studies have used one of these two scales since the early 1980s to regulate and examine the NDE experiences recalled by people. Albeit both NDE research scales have some limitations in their day-to-day applications, they have been predominantly useful during research as they have provided a basic means of delineating an NDE and semi-quantifying the depth of the experience. For example, one person may have a score of 8 on the Grayson scale, whereas somebody else may have a score of 16. The person with the higher score is very likely to have experienced 8 to 10 features of an NDE, whereas the other person has probably experienced 4 to 6 features. In order to be considered valid, the Grayson scale must be given to people who have had what is deemed to have an NDE. If it is given to any mystical experience, then it will give a false value and label some mystical or psychotic experiences as an NDE. NDE incidence estimates are higher with WCEI at 37% average than with the Grayson scale at 18% average. However, if the NDE scale had a minimum criterion of 7, then this yields an NDE incidence of 17%. Agreeing with Dr. Sam Parnia, Director of Research at Stony Brook Medical Center in New York, the NDE research scales created by Drs. Grayson and Ring are extremely valuable, but they have particular restrictions. Future NDE research must focus on expanding more inclusive and precise levels. Currently, both NDE research scales are subjective to the NDE accounts oftentimes provided by people many years after the actual event. From a scientific perspective, NDE researchers are restricted by the fact that they cannot empirically determine how how near to death a person actually was. The reason being, most NDE researchers do not have access to the medical records from the time of the experience and thus are restricted to what the individuals explain of their state. Consequently, an improved criterion scale would be one based upon remembered experiences from individuals who had been proven to be medically near death. Experiences remembered from such a period could truly be called near death or even genuine death experiences. One other complexity is that it is near impossible to know what the individual's personality was before the NDE, as this may have an influence on the scales. While these NDE research scales are currently the best we have, additional effort on them will increase their accuracy. Okay, I'm going to stop there and call this part 1. I will start recording the next one sometime tomorrow, and I will upload the link to this original document in the description. In the next section, we're going to get into really good stuff regarding the morphogenetic fields of our bodies and how that influences our health. And I also find it intriguing how he describes a physical sensation or event for which the lab has no evidence of, because that is something that not only myself but other people that I know have experienced. So this is a very exciting paper. I hope you guys aren't bored yet. I know this beginning is a little tedious and hard to listen to, but stick with it because you're going to learn some really groundbreaking information here. I love you guys.